네, 안녕하세요. 자유대 한국학연구소와 KDI
Good afternoon. We are now going to begin this session organized by the KDI School of Public Policy and Management Institute of the Korea Studies, University of Berlin. I am Eun-Jeung, Dean of Department of History and Culture of the Freie University of Berlin. So the two organizations have co-organized the session. And so far, through the various programs, through the Berlin Korea Center, we have explored what kind of implications the Ukraine war have on the Korean Peninsula. And in this session, based on the discussions that we have had so far, we are going to build on that and explore the directions and the way forward. Because of the time constraint, I would like to briefly introduce to you our panelists, and then we will go to presentation session without further ado. Simultaneous interpretation is available for Korean and English translation. So please use the interpretation button if you need the service. And also please leave your questions in the chat window. In our panelists, we have 3 presenters and 2 discussants. Let me first introduce to you our panelists. Augusto PRADETTO, he's the professor of International Relations at Helmut Schmidt University. He's an emeritus professor, and he studied the political science in the Free University of Berlin. And his major areas of research include the international politics, in particular security, international conflict. Professor PRADETTO is a renowned scholar in international studies and security issues, and he visited the Korea as well as North Korea, and has shown great interest in security issues of Northeast Asia. And also, since the Ukraine war, since the 2014, he has authored a lot of newspaper articles regarding the international conflicts. And so he's a prolific author. And thank you very much for joining us as a panelist. Next is Brandon HOWE. He's the Dean and Professor of Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Women's University. And he studied at Oxford University and graduated from the Dublin Trinity College. Got his PhD there, and his major areas of interest include the security in Northeast Asia, peace, and middle power. Professor HOWE is also a very prolific author, especially with regards to the Northeast Asia security issues. The third panelist is Professor KANG Hojye, and he is the professor of the Institute for Korean Studies at the Free University of Berlin, and he teaches the North Korean studies. He graduated from the Seoul National University and got his PhD there. And especially he's an expert in the history of science and technology development in North Korea, as well as the nuclear weapon. We also have 2 panelists. First, Professor Kim Byung-ju is a visiting professor of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. And he graduated from the MIT. He studied the political science and got his PhD from MIT. He's a scholar, but at the same time, he has been serving as an advisor for various organizations. And also, he's engaged in various professional activities with multiple hats. So in the sense, I think that he could be a very good role model for students who want to be the scholar as well as engaged in a lot of business activities. Next panelist is the Dr. Tereza NOVOTNA. He's a fellow of the Korea-Europe Center at the Free University of Berlin. And also she was working, and she was selected as a research fellow for the Marie Curie project, and she got her PhD in Boston University, and also she studied international politics in the Prague University. She has published a lot of academic papers, and at the same time, she's very active in media as well. So we have 5 panelists for this session, and thank you very much for sharing your valuable time with us. So, Professor PRADETTO, would you please start?
Thank you so much, Eun-Jeung, and thank you for the invitation to this conference, and thank you very much for the opportunity to exchange views on the issues you just touched upon. My presentation will be on how the Ukraine war and the new Cold War between NATO and Russia are changing security logic. Brandon and Hojye will examine South Korea and North Korea in detail. I begin by offering some thoughts regarding the changing geopolitical framework. This geopolitical framework has been successively changing for 2 decades. The Ukraine war has given this shift that is going on a new impetus. My short lecture has 3 chapters. First, the new Cold War and the questioning of previous realities. Second, the Korean conflict and the current geopolitical confrontation. And at the end, there will be a short conclusion. As to the first topic, what is currently emerging is a new Cold War. It could become as or even more conflictual than that one of the 20th century. The old conflict was characterized by military stalemate after its formation phase in the second half of the 1940s and the first half of the 1950s. And in this formation phase, the Korean War played an essential role. In terms of geopolitics and security logic, in Europe and in some other parts of the world, the situation was as if frozen, including the German and Korean divisions. At least for Europe, this ended with the implosion of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Now we are in a new formation phase in the new Cold War. The geopolitical cards are being reshuffled. The security logic is changing analogously to the strategies of the main actors. In principle, and despite all conflict constellations within the West, the USA and its allies are on one side. They want to defend and expand the possessions they won with the end of the old Cold War. Over the past 2 decades, the leading power in the West, the United States, pursued 3 major strategic projects that contributed to the successive formation of a new Cold War from the Western side. The first major project was after 9/11, 2001 terror attacks, the upheaval of the gigantic area of the Middle East, plus North Africa. You see, as Ronald Asmus at that time called it, we change the whole world from Bangladesh to Marrakesh, to Morocco. We know the wars that were waged for this purpose. The list included, among others, Iran, Sudan, and North Korea in the very east. But after Afghanistan, the USA got stuck militarily in Iraq. The second project was NATO's eastward enlargement. Today, NATO includes all countries of the former Warsaw Pact. You can see that the Warsaw Pact on the left side of the slide, and then 20 years later, 20, 30 years later, the reverse situation. Some countries of the former Soviet Union were included, and in addition, a lot of other European countries. And the third, and from the US perspective, crucial long-term project is containing China. The first project failed, the transformation of the Greater Middle East. The second was comparatively successful, but led to increasing conflicts with Russia. And the third is underway with China and not yet decided. Russia no longer accepts the borders and border shifts drawn with the end of the Cold War and what followed. The strategic aim of the Putin regime is to regain control, at least in those areas where Russians live, that is partly in ex-Soviet, but now independent neighboring countries like Ukraine. The consequences have been dramatic in Europe since February of this year. Russia is not only waging a war of conquest in Ukraine, Moscow is simultaneously waging a war and a proxy war against Western influence in Central Europe. The US and NATO are not only supplying high-grade weapons so that Ukraine can defend itself, but they are also simultaneously waging a proxy war, namely against Russia. China wants to expand and accepts fewer and fewer restrictions from the West. The strategic goal is to keep or regain full control over all China and to create multiple opportunities in order to play a leading role in global affairs. This results in conflicts with Hong Kong, what we could observe in the past month and weeks, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, and others. For China, despite all differences and distinctions, there's a clear parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. In both cases, the West is trying to claim for itself and to influence territories that are considered by its large neighbors to be existential and belonging to them. Beijing is convinced that the West is threatening the unity and security of China by supporting more autonomy, for example, of Taiwan, of Tibet, or Xinjiang. This congruence of interests also results in China's de facto support for Moscow's containment efforts against the West in the case of Ukraine. The current experience with Russia is also increasingly projected onto China by the West. Since the start of the Ukraine war, the pace of geopolitical confrontation has accelerated considerably. The intensification of the US-China conflict over Taiwan in recent weeks is an expression of this acceleration. This may well cool down again and more dialogue take place, but in the longer term, as in the past 20 years, a stronger political policy and a security logic of confrontation is more likely. Why? Neither in Washington, nor in Moscow, nor in Beijing are there any political leaders in sight who are committed to a policy of détente and conflict mitigation. As to the second topic, thus, the current geopolitical trend is moving largely in the same direction as in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Greater political separation, economic autarky, and military rearmament. At the same time, the ranks of the actors in both opposing camps are being closed. For the future on the Korean Peninsula, this means as little relaxation in the short and medium term as is the case for Europe. In any case, the long-term trend in the development of North Korea's arms and test program corresponds to the described spiral of geopolitical escalation in recent years. The table speaks for itself. On the one hand, on the other hand, the new South Korean administration under President Yoon has reinvigorated the so-called decapitation strategy, that is military planning for preemptive and retaliatory strikes against the North Korean leadership under the so-called kill chain and Korean massive punishment and retaliation strategy, respectively. The current state of global geopolitical reordering can be seen in the East-West allocation of political elites and states in the Ukraine war, far from completely, but at least selectively. Only the states colored deep blue are unreservedly on Ukraine's side. All others are either indifferent or argue against the Ukrainian leadership's desire for a ceasefire and the start of negotiations between the parties to the conflict, or even support the Russian position. For North Korea, the current geopolitical conflict developments are likely to mean stronger support for its policies from both China and Russia. The already limited cooperation with the US in containing Pyongyang is likely to be a thing of the past, at least for the time being, as is the US-China dialogue on climate issues or bilateral cooperation on military matters in general. This has significant implications for the ability of the United Nations Security Council and international organizations such as the Atomic Energy Agency to influence the conflict with North Korea. The resumption of South Korean US military maneuvers is in line with the logic of this development. The inter-Korean conflict is being again instrumentalized to a greater extent by the internal parties involved for their power political interests and by the external actors for their geopolitical ambitions. Now my conclusion. First, I would like to take up the historical analogy once again with regard to the Cold War of the 20th century. The Korean War at the beginning of the 1950s was not only an expression of an internal power struggle, but also the extreme intensification of a geopolitical struggle. A learning process among those with political responsibility did not begin until after the near catastrophe in the early 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost led to a nuclear exchange between the superpowers. Over the next 20 years, the responsible actors learned how to initiate territorial recognition, arms control, and cooperation agreements through dialogue, negotiation, and compromise. In the last 20 years, we have witnessed a country movement, an increasing loss of those competences that a generation of politicians has painstakingly acquired in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Today we are witnessing an increasing re-ideologization and increasing geopolitics of foreign policy. One structural condition is the new options, opportunities, and power shifts that have resulted from the collapse of the Soviet Union. The re-ideologization is accompanied by the increase of a kind of existentialized variant of the thesis of the clash of civilizations. The geopolitical conflict now is increasingly portrayed as an existential cultural survival conflict. Russia and China claim that the US and the West want to annihilate Russian and Chinese civilization. The West conversely claims the same. And this existentialization of conflicts means a reduction of opportunities and possibilities to communicate about conflicts in a factual and pragmatic way. Is this development not stopped, we could soon be facing another HOWE moment, be it in East Asia, be it in Europe. We already experienced something along these lines these days with the Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, which has apparently been instrumentalized against all reason and has become a pawn in political blackmail. So I know optimism looks different. The way out in the Cold War was a de-existentialization in dealing with each other. The more both sides agreed to negotiate and reach agreements on concrete issues such as economic or scientific cooperation or confidence-building measures in military matters, the more they moved in the direction of a general détente. And that, among other things, is what Brandon and Hojye, my subsequent speakers, are dealing with. Thank you very much for attention.
네, 프라데토 교수님.
Thank you very much, Professor PRADETTO. So he said that we have to see the Ukraine war and how it is connected with the Korean war issues in terms of history, and also how the policies on the Korean Peninsula are linked with the Ukraine war. So thank you very much for that broad, comprehensive presentation. Following that, the Brandon HOWE professor will give us the presentation. Professor HOWE.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just see if I can share my PowerPoint. Okay, well, thank you very much for the help, and thank you for inviting me to engage in this important dialogue. And I want to talk about the implications of the invasion of Ukraine from the perspective of Korea's geopolynomic positioning, and in particular from different conceptualizations of Korea as a middle power, and how this is reflected in changing positioning. So despite its ambiguity, the concept of middle power has been prominent in South Korea's diplomatic narrative for a number of administrations. But there are actually three middle power conceptualizations related to the three possible East Asian geopolynomic structures which are important for South Korea. First, the external impact upon Korea of the geostrategic US-China-Japan triangle, wherein the smaller power finds itself surrounded by regional and global behemoths and their proxies. So a hierarchical measurement of middle powerism. Secondly, we have the South Korea, North Korea, Southeast Asia humanitarian geoeconomic peace and development triangle, with Seoul at the apex, pursuing policies appropriate to middle powermanship in its near abroad. Third, we have the South Korea-Japan Association of Southeast Asian Nations geopolitical triangle, wherein South Korea has the potential to promote its middle power internationalist credentials in partnership with like-minded political entities. So my plan today, if I have time, is to talk about two global impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine from a South Korean perspective. First, the implications for Korea's geostrategic and geoeconomic position, and second, the impact on South Korea's humanitarian positioning, which has been the foundation of Seoul's attempts to punch above its weight through niche diplomatic focusing. These impacts must also be addressed with reference to President Yoon taking office on May the 10th. So first of all, the geostrategic triangulation in Northeast Asia, hierarchical conceptualization of middle powers as those powers which lack compulsory power, the military resources to dominate other countries, or the economic resources to bribe other countries. But nevertheless, they differ from small or ineffectual states which have little or no influence. They are potentially system-affecting states which can have significant impact within a narrower policy area or in conjunction with others. So there's a strategic imperative from this perspective for Korea to find a geographical and policy niche in which it can get more bang for its buck, or won, and punch above its diplomatic weight. These attempts at securing niche diplomatic relevance have met, at best, with limited success. Playing political hardball with Japan has not resulted in diplomatic gains for South Korea and may even have damaged the country's international reputation. China's rise, of course, has had the largest impacts on the traditional East Asian triangle. Relations significantly deteriorated over the 2016-2017 deployment in South Korea of the American THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system. And central to incoming President Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy commitments is rebuilding South Korea's alliance with the US. So the incoming administration risks being seen as a reactive state in terms of lacking an independent peace and security vision for Northeast Asia. What these geostrategic calculations reveal is the weakness of Korea's hand in diplomatic negotiations in Northeast Asia, in relation not only to China, but also to the US. What Ellen Kim and Victor Cha have likened to being between a rock and a hard place. So that Korea is actually getting diminishing bang for the buck by focusing on traditional power hierarchies in the region. If we look at responses to the invasion, from Moon to Yoon, and the importance of Russia in strategic calculations. Before the invasion and the election, Korea had been pursuing a policy of diversifying its geopolitic engagement with and dependency on a rather limited number of security and trade partners. Part of this meant attempting to balance the demands of its chief security guarantor, the US, and its chief trading partner, the PRC. It also meant reaching out to another major geopolitic player, Russia. South Korea and Russia have become important trading partners, ranked 8th overall for Russian exports and 10th overall for Korean exports. But they've become central partners in certain key areas: petroleum products from Russia to Korea and automobiles in the other direction. Trade between the two countries has increased steadily year on year, peaking in 2021, despite the global shrinkage of trade and distortion of supply chains caused by the impact of COVID-19. Russia is important to South Korea, first of all, in terms of mutual economic dependency, but secondly, in terms of diversification away from dependency upon the US and Australia as energy suppliers, and away from China and the US as markets for Korean products. Perhaps not surprisingly, therefore, Korea's initial response to Russia's invasion was relatively measured when compared with other allies of the US. The Moon Jae-in government supported international sanctions against Russia, but in contrast to Japan and Australia, it did not impose independent sanctions. South Korea did ultimately decide to ban the direct import of strategic materials, such as semiconductors, halted transactions with major Russian banks, and, unlike many other Asian countries, condemned the Russian invasion in direct policy statements at the United Nations. Meanwhile, rebuilding South Korea's alliance with the US is central to President Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy commitments. This is a recognition of perhaps Washington's frustration with the previous administration. Yoon has made it clear that his administration will not shy away from contentious issues, such as expanding the deployment of THAAD and even exploring joining the strategic Quad with Australia, Japan, US, and India. South Korea has emerged as the world's fastest growing arms exporter, vastly outpacing the growth of other major market players in recent years. Indonesia and the Philippines are particularly large markets. But Korea has just announced it will supply Poland with $15 to $20 billion worth of NATO spec arms. Seoul will sell to Warsaw 1,000 K2 tanks, 648 K9 self-propelled guns, 48 FA-50 light combat jets. And backfilling will then allow Poland to redeploy Soviet-era arms to the Ukraine. Changing geostrategic environment means for Eun that Seoul needs to play a leading role in areas that necessitate our part. Specifically, it necessitates taking a greater part in pressurizing Russia. When we're asked by the international community to participate more, we need to firmly demonstrate our attitude of respect for international rules-based order, according to Eun. South Korean export controls and sanctions against Russia and deepened ties to NATO will, of course, carry economic and diplomatic costs going forward. Russia has already placed South Korea on its list of unfriendly countries. Chinese pundits have warned that Seoul, in its tilt towards the US and away from its traditional stance of balancing, that this will end badly for South Korea. Before deciding whether to seek entry into the Quad, however, Yoon has stated that South Korea will support and cooperate with its working groups in tackling global issues such as vaccine distribution and climate change. At the Seoul Summit in May 21 and 22, the comprehensive nature of their partnership was emphasized with discussions on a wide range of commitments. Nevertheless, with further saber rattling from Pyongyang, North Korea once again took central stage. The Ukraine crisis does, however, allow the Yoon government to showcase fairly early on what their interpretation of a principled foreign policy looks like, one that supposedly advances freedom, peace, and prosperity in defense of a liberal international law, as Yoon put it in an article for Foreign Affairs. So these issues spill over into other areas of geopolynomic triangulation, including the implications for South Korea's humanitarian policy making and middle power niche diplomacy. So liberal international relations scholars have emphasized middle powermanship relating to the diplomatic behavior and intentions of states as the key factor for identification of middle power polities. Korea has a significant history of liberal middle power advocacy in terms of promoting peace, the environment, and development. So a second geopolynomic East Asian triangulation becomes important, that between South Korea and North Korea and Southeast Asian countries as partnerships for peace and development. This triangulation has already borne significant fruit and holds considerable promise for further progress. I'm conscious I don't have much time, so I'm going to skip the previous administration's approaches to promoting humanitarian initiatives in Northeast and Southeast Asia. Just looking at the Moon's proposal for a Northeast Asian peace community involving a Northeast Asian peace and cooperation platform, a new Northern policy, and perhaps most importantly, from today's perspective, a new Southern policy, because the incoming Yoon administration has vowed to take a tougher stance with North Korea and fall more consistently in line with US positions on dealing with Pyongyang. But it's also proposed an ABCD strategy towards Southeast Asia: advance human capital, build health security, connect cultures, and digitize Asian infrastructure. This looks very much to be a continuation of Moon's new Southern policy focused on people, peace, and prosperity. Potentially, however, I think the greatest reward for middle power Korea could be the extent to which the pursuit of liberal normative niche diplomacy spills over into the third conceptualization of middle powerism and the related third East Asian triangle of South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, in terms of regional peace and non-traditional security cooperation. Middle powers have been seen as countries that have the power to assert their influence in regional settings and have the intention enthusiastically to advocate multilateral cooperation. And certainly, South Korea has played a bridging role in such multilateral fora. In fact, with both South Korea and Japan pursuing multilateral non-traditional security agendas within the East Asian geopolitical triangle, there's considerable potential for this normative and institutional cooperation to spill over into confidence building, de-escalation, and ultimately cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. Yoon's explicit principled foreign policy platform is already committed not only to build on existing non-traditional security partnerships, but also to a greater engagement with multilateral institutions and networks of peace and security. So this is where we get to what I see as comprehensive peace building and middle power activism. Regional middle powers, either acting unilaterally or in concert, have a great deal to gain by taking the lead in non-traditional security and peace-building initiatives. In fact, this could be seen as a noble opportunity to do something that is both normatively right and beneficial to others, while also in the national interest. The inadequate responses of the great powers to the COVID-19 crisis have thrust the responses of the middle powers into the spotlight. 4 of the most successful responses have come from East Asian middle powers and their civic societies: South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Vietnam. Collaboration in this arena could ultimately spill over into at least confidence and trust building between Korea and Japan. So rather than lament geostrategic inadequacies and challenges, it would benefit regional second-tier actors to divert at least some of their resources to exploring solutions to seemingly intractable challenges through radical non-traditional security thinking. In business terms, the term disruptive innovation was coined to describe an innovation that creates a new market and value network and eventually disrupts an existing market and value network. Here, I'd apply it to the radical out-of-the-box thinking and practices needed to address traditional security and non-traditional security challenges in East Asia. These would include, but would not be limited to, regional international commissions on such varied issues as nuclear proliferation, governance failure, water security, the South China Sea dispute, pandemic response, transnational pollution, DRR, and the promotion and protection of human security. So I think that South Korea could almost be seen as having a responsibility to disrupt. Now, I'm going to skip through a bunch more slides because these are all examples of what I mean until we get to maybe okay, so humanitarian policy making. Humanitarian policy making, or principled foreign policy as niche diplomacy, is one area of consistency between different administrations in Seoul. Outgoing President Moon Jae-in's humanitarian commitment being clear from the early stated vision of a nation of the people, a just Republic of Korea. New policy initiatives included the aspirational Northeast Asia Plus Community of Responsibility project. The ambitious aim was to build a sustainable regional system of cooperation with the 10 member states of ASEAN, the middle power grouping of MICTA, India, and Northeast Asian states. Korea's new Southern policy sought to elevate the relationship between South Korea and ASEAN, as well as India, to the same level as the one between the Republic of Korea and its 4 strategic neighbors. But despite all these aspirations, South Korea accepted just 0.4% of non-North Korean refugees in 2020, 52 out of 6,684 applications. Seoul initially promised to provide $10 million in emergency humanitarian assistance to help the Ukraine government, people, and refugees. But President Yoon pointed out that this amounted to only 20 cents per Ukrainian citizen, an amount he considered woefully inadequate. Hence, he directed his staff to investigate how this humanitarian assistance could be increased. The outgoing Moon administration did vote to suspend Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council and later upped its pledge for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine to $40 million. But Yoon envisages Korea as a global pivotal state, one that advances freedom, peace, and prosperity through liberal democratic values and substantial cooperation. This means, if it's followed up on, that Korea needs to take on more non-traditional security responsibilities. This goes a lot further than the Green Climate Fund. It goes a lot further than accepting the international obligations under this, the 1.5 degree temperature limit to which Seoul is party. It means providing proactive leadership. Regional cooperation will play an increasingly important role, with Yoon proposing that the ABCD strategy will reflect something of a continuation of Moon's New Southern policy, but also will look to improve relations with other major liberal powers, in particular the regional liberal power, Japan. So international crises linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether geopolitical or humanitarian, represent both threat to and opportunity for South Korean activism on the international stage. The stepped up international role for South Korea that Yoon envisaged will be welcomed, especially at a moment where there are increasing strains on the ability of nations to contribute simultaneously to the international security agenda and the international humanitarian agenda. So there could be a happy coincidence of Seoul pursuing its own national interest, striving to get the biggest bang it can for its niche diplomatic buck, while at the same time contributing to international stability and the well-being of the most vulnerable. Yet, as is always the case in the volatile Korean landscape, such international cooperation is only likely to materialize if Yoon can maintain strong domestic political support for his leadership. This is already showing signs of weakening. It could further be undermined by the impact of the very policies he proposes. Siding explicitly with Western liberal international order powers could lead to severe economic repercussions due to retaliatory measures from both Russia and China. As part of this engagement with liberal coalition supporting the international rule of law, rapprochement with Japan could also lead to domestic pushback. Expanding commitments to refugees and migrants beyond ethnic Koreans could also meet with resistance at home. Nevertheless, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not only unified the target country, but also Europe, NATO, and even the West and the non-West at the UN to an unprecedented degree. Meanwhile, South Korea may well have reached peak expenditure in terms of generating returns on geopolynomic investment in its unilateral roles in Northeast Asia. So there's an added incentive for Korea to pursue a more networked model of diplomacy. As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, combined with the election of Yoon Suk-yeol, Korea is likely, therefore, to be a more engaged multilateral actor, but maybe with less room for independent policy activity. Thank you very much.
네, 브랜든 감사합니다.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Amid this international development, the role of Korea in this crisis can be understood in the future mechanism, and we can learn from you what roles can be expected and what is the prospect for our future in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Professor Kang to be punctual so that we can have enough time to have the discussions for all of you. Thank you. Start, please. Can you see my slide? Thank you. I'll try to be punctual. Thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking on a more specific and narrow-scoped areas. This can be also very sensitive. The most important issue in the Korean Peninsula is the North Korean nuclear issue out of all the relationships of the inter-Korean arena. How the North Korea does with the denuclearization or the nuclear power will make the future of ours, and that is also considered in conjunction with the war in Ukraine as well. So I believe that the implication is quite high, and there has been some connection with the war in Ukraine as well. What I'm going to do with you today is to have some facts and non-facts, because we have to distinguish what is factual and what is not. Also, in terms of the North Korea, we do have some issues of scientific and technological field as well. So some of these factual things do not require elaboration or further understanding, but still we have misunderstanding. Why is that? I would like to talk about the reasons why. And also, I believe that there should be a different understanding of the current situation. So I'm going to now divide the understanding into two, phase 1 and phase 2. Also, in the Korean Peninsula, we can also talk about the security matters in the Peninsula. And because of these issues, all these three agendas have been useless at the moment. So with all this closure of the connections and relationships, what is the next step for us? So I'd like to use the remainder of the time to talk about these things. Now, I'll start with the issue of the nuclear state, because North Korea declared itself as a nuclear state. It has been a while since we learned the news about the nuclear tests and missile launches by North Korea, so we don't exactly know when it was that the North Korea declared itself as a nuclear state. However, we have to remember that it was this November 29th of 2017 when it did. So North Korea became a nuclear state while launching the Hwasong-15, which had the warhead based on the nuclear missiles. So it was not only a demonstration but also a performance of the which is kind of show by North Korea to say that that was a nuclear state. Of course, nuclear issues can be dated back to the 1990s, but officially speaking, we can know that the next chapter was opened by North Korea in the year of 2017. In this regard, we can also think of the relationships between North Korea and other countries, and there was a blockade of such relationship. In response to that, North Korea was also faced with the sanctions very strictly and severely by the rest of the countries in the world. The main logic, which is the nuclear power, is that the nuclear state is quite different from the conventional weapons. Therefore, it is called as a strategic weapon. So the nuclear arsenal is something that nobody can use, but is a very strong one, therefore. And it is controlled by the leadership as a strategy. And then since we have the nuclear in possession, we now are entering into a very different chapter of the relationship. And they say that the possession of nuclear weapon can endanger the whole world. And there is also the other side we have to look into. In the 1970s, when the North Korea did not have the nuclear capability, that was not clear what we can expect from it. However, in the 2017, now that North Korea has the nuclear capability and North Korea is disillusioned by the fact that nuclear will keep their country under check and nobody would dare to invade North Korea because of the nuclear presence. That was kind of illusion that North Korea has. So they have a lot of materials and technologies developed for the nuclear because of their level of technology. The all other countries outside North Korea believe that North Korea will not be able to reach the pinnacle of the technology because nobody is teaching them and nobody is providing the materials. That is also another illusion that the Western world has, because it is not that the student cannot teach himself. Even without a teacher, anybody can teach himself or herself and reach the pinnacle of the knowledge. So as the life teaches us. Therefore, it is always possible for North Korea to have the best technology of nuclear missiles. And then we can see that North Korea has somehow did that. So probably they have some knowledge about everything about nuclear arsenal. Now we have two things that we can talk about in the nuclear weapons. Two sides of them are, one is missile, the other is nuclear warhead. By phase, North Korea was successfully showing that they have both of the technologies. Now we are watching that they have these two things in possession. So suddenly they became a nuclear state as they declare itself. So all of a sudden we now have another nuclear state in the world. So when was that North Korea released that to the public? So it was 1993 when the missile was launched with 1,000 kilometers. And then after that they had the new table turning up for the North Korea. So that's why they had the basic agreement between North Korea and the U.S. in 1994. And also in 1998, they also tried something else. It's called Eun-Ją, and something launched by the North Korea was in the orbit. So it was running in the orbit. That is why also they had the North Korea and the U.S. agreement in 1998 and afterwards. Now in 2017, Hwasong-12 was also launched again. Then now we saw that they have the capabilities to get across the continent with the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missile. They also had the nuclear warhead test as well. The first one was 2006. Of course, there are disagreements amongst ourselves about the size and the level of technology of the North Korea in this nuclear warhead. But it was a fact, not deniable, that North Korea made a warhead, whatever the size might be. After that, they have the series of 11 explosions and experiments. They use various types of warheads, various types of materials. Based on the materials they used, we can have the classifications of 2 or 3 types of warheads. Our guess is that North Korea did try everything to have their experiment with the warhead. It's not about the explosion underground. It was also simulation that they did. So they now have another level of capability to be able to test everything on screen, not underground. Now that they have the ICBM to be combined with the nuclear warhead, we were able to see that happening in 2017. As I said, that was when North Korea declared itself as a nuclear state. So in November 29th of 2017, they launched Hwasong-15, and that has a range of 10,000 to 12,000 kilometers. It means that they have the range to be covering the territory of the United States, and that was kind of claimed as a successful launch. As you all know very well, in 2017, when North Korea declared itself as a nuclear state, some people didn't believe it, and some people were just wondering. But 5 years have passed since then until today, and nobody cannot deny that North Korea actually reached that level. So it is the high time for us to have a second thought about the position of North Korea. We can have the phase 1 and phase 2 in thinking of the new strategy. The first phase is quite clear. They must have something under development. So if the development phase is phase 1, they do not have the possession of the nuclear arsenals yet, so they have some influx of the sci-tech. So in order to block the influx of sci-tech, we used a very detailed and pinpoint skills and policy to block the science and technology. That way, we had to exclude this humanitarian aid as well. Then that became a problem because we were not helping people in the North Korea either. So we had new sanctions under North Korea. So after 2017, the harshest level of sanctions were placed on the North Korea. The sanction does not mean that North Korea cannot pursue their nuclear capabilities, only it delayed and slowed down the speed of it. Now we can talk about the phase 2. The phase 2 means the time after North Korea completed the program. So what can we do about North Korea if they have completed the program? Then we have to take this technology out of North Korea. We have to just get this science and technology from North Korea. But everybody knows that it is not possible once they have the capability. Just try to remember what happened in Ukraine. Once they have all the materials and supplies inside the territory, what they did was to have the taking of all the materials and supplies out of the country and territory. And then the U.S. started to be in function. That seems to be successful in a way as an operation, but maybe that is not possible in North Korea. So if that is not possible with North Korea to take the nuclear technology out of North Korea once they have it, why don't we have a conversion or diversion of the nuclear technology from North Korea? So why don't we cooperate amongst ourselves to make North Korea use the materials, resources, and technology of nuclear missiles for other purposes? In that way, we can at least reduce the tension around the nuclear development. So what we can do, if it is a phase 2, is to reduce the level of tension. If we cannot solve the problem very accurately, so we have to divert their purposes or uses of the nuclear capabilities for other purposes. The best way of doing that is to have the engagement or to more actively entanglement with North Korea, not having the sanctions on that North Korea. So I would say that it is more desirable for us to have the engagement or entanglement with North Korea. Let's imagine that there is a car submerged underwater. So the car should have the windows open inside the water for the passengers to come out of the car. But once the car is submerged inside the water, there's no way of opening the window because of the pressure difference between inside and outside the vehicle. What you have to do in order to rescue the people inside the car is to take the opening, take the air out from the car so that they can breathe out and they can be out of the car. Therefore, I can relate that to the North Korean issue with the car accident. We can have the North Korea use their capabilities for other purposes rather than just pushing them further. So there are many ways of doing that. First one I would recommend is to have the spin-off. So we can have more active engagement with North Korea, being more active so that we can convince them to use their technologies for nuclear arsenals for other purposes, like the commercial ones or the private ones. And we can also transfer military resources to the civilian side by doing so. So is North Korea ready? I think so. I think North Korea is somewhat ready to accept that offer. Now let's link it to the Ukrainian war. So with the war in Ukraine, everything has been changed. And now we have the time when we have to think differently about the logic of the measures fundamentally. All the security and the Korean Peninsula has now entered a new phase. There are three important factors here. The first one is denuclearization of North Korea. The second one is sanction. And the third one is six-party talk, which is also called as the multilateral security. So first one, that are just being obsolete nowadays, is the denuclearization of North Korea. And because of the war in Ukraine, we lost a good example. Because of the war in Ukraine, if Ukraine did not abandon their nuclear capabilities, they would not be in a war like this today. And the second one, this is the most important one, if the sanction is against North Korea only, we can expect that North Korea will just yield to it. But they know now that Ukraine is also under strain. Because of the war, it is Ukraine who suffers the most, while the Russian economy is getting better. So North Korea is actually breathing better because of the war in Ukraine, because they feel that the sanctions are loosening in a de facto manner. And the third one that I think regrettable is the former mechanism of six-party talk. Six-party talk was exemplified by the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process is gone as well, so they do not have any model to take after. So here, what we can do, or what I can suggest is that is not to use or proliferate nuclear systems or programs for North Korea. So we have to ask them to lessen the tension. Next, second, for the sanction, what we can ask North Korea is to have, and the other parties as well, is to have the engagement and entanglement. I also suggest all of our parties to have the one-to-one direct conversation with North Korea instead of 6-to-1 discussions or six-party talks. Also, I'd like to suggest that we have to encourage the cooperation with North Korea. We can start now with North Korea because we can always start direct relationship. And also especially we have to reduce the tension through the cooperation on the field of science and technology. So when the technology of nuclear programs are concentrated, from then we can have spin-off or diversion of the technologies from inside the North Korea to outside or to other civilian sectors. Second, I can also suggest that we have to prioritize science technology over politics, because they have the policies to put the emphasis on the science and technology, and that should be also taken care of. Next, I'd like to also suggest that we have to emphasize the civilian usage of sci-tech. We can also convince North Korea think about that. So that would be the way to improve the livelihood of the people in the North Korea. And that has been also underway for so long, and they're now seeing very abrupt and sudden changes inside North Korea. The so-called startups, as we call it in the Western world, is now emerging and burgeoning in the North Korea. They call it the new industrial revolution companies. Another suggestion I can make is to start from the online-based archives and education. And we can do all these kinds of education activities with the North. this one was also exemplified by North Korea. We know that they have the new programs which is done on a virtual manner to reduce the gap between the central and regional areas of North Korea. If we can be engaging with North Korea in terms of the education of science and technology, it will be a very good way to reduce the tension, and that can be also one of the alternatives that I can suggest to you. So e-learning or online lectures can be utilized. So that's the thing we can do using the momentum of the Ukraine war in the East European world. Thank you very much, Professor Kang. So he has been giving us the internal relationship of the Ukraine war between Ukraine and North Korea. The Ukraine war has multiple meanings. They have the international implications on one side, externally seen, and they have internal implications, and we can see how they can be understood with their camps between Ukraine, Russia, and North Korea. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Kim Byung-ju to start the discussion.
To comment on these three wonderful presentations. Let me try to manage my time as efficiently as possible. First of all, starting with Professor PRADETTO's wonderful, insightful presentation. One of the key things that his presentation reminded us is the way the world community is thinking about this overall situation of what's happening in Ukraine and what it means for great power politics and what it means for Korea. And here, what I noticed is that more than ever before, many of the strategists are talking about this case and having their discourse in the form of explaining the grand chess game of big powers, or a kind of billiard ball game, a style of unified actors taking their actions, calculating their interests and the national gains and losses and all that kind of stuff. The thing is, I mean, absolutely, in the great tradition of international relations, academia, this realist thinking is of great value. It has a lot of values and importance in thinking about these countries acting as a unified rational actor, kind of taking their choices, making their choices based on their calculations, interest, and so on. But the thing is, if we go too much into that direction about thinking about these kind of issues, what does Ukraine situation mean for Korea and Northeast Asia and all that? We may be drawn into too much of this kind of imaginary thinking that has increasing irrelevance to the reality. What I mean by that is, absolutely, we have to be reminded that what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Taiwan, those two cases have a lot to do with the domestic political calculation of those two countries' individual political leaders. Putin, in the way he's thinking about the way he wants to stay in power, and Xi Jinping, in the way he's thinking about wanting to stay in power over and beyond his 3-term limits, the result of which we'll find out probably sometime in coming weeks from Beijing. So rather than thinking about all this kind of picture in terms of great powers playing chess games, we should not let go of our sight in also at the same time simultaneously understanding and thinking these state behaviors as a result of individual political leaders' personal interest calculation. For sure, this calculation doesn't have to take place in a outright intentionally mode. This kind of calculation could actually take place within subconsciousness level as well. But the thing is, if we ever lose sight of this domestic political calculations behind these power games, I think we could lose sight of important picture. I think that's what Professor PRADETTO has his presentation has reminded us. That's one point I came away with from his wonderful and insightful presentation. Professor HOWE's presentation, I was thinking about two things. Number one is one of his points that he emphasized, the need for Tokyo and Seoul to reconciliate and improve their ties. And in doing so, what I see, I think his presentation has reminded us the great challenge that the current conservative Yoon government faces going forward in terms of making improvement here at home in Korea. As we all know, in Korea, people like supporters of previous President Moon, for instance, they insist upon the notion, in order for the bilateral tie between Tokyo and Seoul to improve, what will have to happen is Japan has to come as a unified country, everyone agreeing on the notion that they have to apologize fully, unconditionally to the Korean people for what happened 77 decades or a century ago. And there should be no qualifiers, no conditions attached, and there'll have to be no dissenting voices. The whole country will have to come to Korea, apologize unconditionally. That's what the people on the progressive side here in Korea are insisting upon, and how President Yoon will manage this domestic dynamics going forward will be a great question and issue as we think about the improvement of the Tokyo-Seoul ties going forward. Second point that I came away with, from Professor HOWE's wonderful presentation was his emphasis on the need for switching focus to humanitarian emphasis in policymaking, taking advantage of this Ukraine situation, asking South Korea to focus on this humanitarian side of diplomacy and seek a better return on that. It's a wonderful idea. I think it's a really important idea. We should give a serious thought to it. And at the same time, having been inside Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working as a diplomat myself, the government process, when this kind of important things happening outside, all these things is basically a matter of budgetary allocation. If we want to shift our focus to humanitarian side, then we should come up with bigger size of budget. And the question of, under the given situation of Ukraine, what we see there in that part of the world, would it be possible, and in how, tactical sense, how can we ask for greater allocation of budget into humanitarian diplomacy when there will be great demand and desire to see dramatic increase on the immediate defense capability increase aspect of the budget. Buy more weapons, build more weapons, develop more new weapons. Those calls will be even more immediate. So in order to make Professor HOWE's wonderful point, make it implementable, I think we should come up with more, how would you say it, more kind of tactful tactics, if you will, in how to make that kind of shift. I think that requires a lot of careful thinking altogether. Now, lastly, I think I'm managing my time quite all right here. And lastly, on Professor Kang's point about his call for encouraging North Korea to use their foundation for nuclear weaponization for the use of more of the civilian use, what he calls mode transfer or mode transformation. It's, once again, very, very good idea, wonderful idea, very insightful idea. And in thinking about how that can take place, I also was thinking about the case elsewhere around the world. The case that may actually offer some challenges to Professor Kang's notion. That is what Israel has been doing towards Iran. In nuclear weaponization process, not only material, not only physical capabilities, the system of the nuclear weapons, but perhaps more importantly, the brain power. The people who can build the bombs have been often become targets of assassination and measures to denuclearization. So to what extent, if somehow Professor Kang, what he means is using this foundation, when he says foundation, are we talking about perhaps brain power? I think it is. I mean, I don't think he means a lot about the physical side of the foundation, but I guess it's more about human resources side. And then these scientists, we know they have long been on a potential target list for any force that may want to denuclearize North Korea. They will have to want to get rid of these brain powers. So how do we juggle the realist approach to managing North Korea's nuclear weapons on one hand? I mean, we have different parties involved in this game. And how do we juggle this realist approach to denuclearization of North Korea on one hand, and implementing Professor Kang's wonderful idea of encouraging North Korea to use their foundations of nuclear weaponization for civilian and peaceful use through direct engagement with Pyongyang. That will have to take place through different participants, of course. So how do we juggle between the two? That will be a very, very challenging question, I guess, to address before, as we go ahead with this wonderful idea. So those thoughts I came away with based upon these three wonderful presentations. I guess I've been perfect in managing time.
예, 네, perfect 하셨습니다. 시간
Yes, you were perfect in your time management.
저도 시간을 더
Now,
절약하기 위해서
I'll be also
노보트나
saving some time. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Novotna to continue your discussion.
Yes. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for great presentations, which I was very much impressed with. I will try to make some comments about all of them, or I was taking quite a lot of notes very diligently, and then I will also ask some questions. I'll maybe start from
we have just a few minutes time. Could you try to make it short? Sorry.
Yes. I'll start from the back. So I'll start with first Dr. Kang's presentation. I mean, you raised various very good points. For instance, that the Ukraine is sort of a that example for how denuclearization may lead to the fact that then the country is attacked. I mean, we still don't know how war develops, so let's see. But there's also the case of the JCPOA, which is now in the stage when there is the last proposal. So let's see whether there will be any agreement. So, not all the cases are bad cases. You've spoken about sanctions and how they are ineffective. In that regard, I think it's interesting to point out that North Korea has lost the pleasure of being the most sanctioned country in the world. Nowadays, it's Russia, surely from the European side. But maybe there's a difference in the way or what the sanctions want to achieve. When it comes to sanctions on North Korea, the goal is rather to make it do something. So, to make to the negotiating table to give up its nuclear developments, while the sanctions in the Russian case are there to stop doing something. So stop Russia invading neighboring countries. So then, we also have to look at them from that perspective. But in terms of my questions, just to play devil's advocate, you sort of said with the example of the car accident, it made sense to prevent North Korea from developing sci-tech until it got nukes. but now once it has it, then it's kind of okay. You know, it's a bit like saying that, you know, we are trying to prevent bank robberies, but once it happens and the thieves have the money, then, you know, we should just sort of let them go. So, you know, how would you address this issue? Also, the fact that it's not a good situation for others. And the second question I had, you know, your point that there should be discussion one-on-one. So what type of discussions do you mean? Because we've had discussions, inter-Korean discussions one-on-one. We also have had discussions US and North Korea, and neither of those two really led to any you know, outcome, especially since North Korea is not willing to negotiate. So, you know, what type of other one-to-one discussions do you have in mind? I'll move now to Brendan's presentation, which has been very rich as always, so thank you very much. I quite like your point about the names geostrategy, geoeconomic, and geopolitical triangles and geopolynomics. So it's a bit difficult to pronounce, but it makes lots of sense. So that's really a nice way how to put it. Also, thank you for bringing in other aspects of security, including obviously human security, and also for bringing in ASEAN countries or Southeast Asia. In this regard, my question would be, you know, you talked about Moon Jae-in's NSP plus policies, and you know, how this may spill over to relations with Japan. I mean, there's been lots of discussion about Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific strategies. So do you see that President Yoon will come up with some kind of a new strategy, new framework? I believe that the government is working on something like that. And how do you think that you know, the previous successful Moon's policy will play into it? If you know, if it at all, obviously, South Korean presidents always like to come up with something totally brand new. The second question you mentioned toward the end, that the success of President Yoon's policy depend on you know, his popularity. Have you seen any polls regarding the support of ordinary Koreans for the war in Ukraine, or rather the policies of the Yoon government or the previous government when it comes to Ukraine? And now to the last presentation by Professor PRADETTO, who has you know, very nicely tied in both European issues and broader aspects of Northeast Asia security. I can just find my notes. Yeah, here we are. Maybe two points. The one, I mean, you didn't put it this way, admittedly, but you know, you were showing that the new Cold War from the Western side, one of these aspects is basically the NATO enlargement. Admittedly, you said that it's a successful policy, but at the same time, this is quite often being used as you know, the way to say why Russia has been sort of justified in its aggression towards Ukraine. And in a way, you said that Russia wants to, regain the territories of the former Soviet Union, or possibly at least those where the Russians live. But actually, if you look at the NATO enlargement, the last round, or several last rounds from 2009 to 2020 were towards the Balkans. So actually, the last NATO enlargement that moved the border of NATO closer to Russia happened in 2004, which is 18 years ago. So how could an enlargement that happened 18 years ago threaten Russia now? And how can Russia sort of use it as a justification for the war? So that would be one point. And the second point, going maybe also to what Professor Kim was saying in his discussing points about your very realist perspective. and that leads me to the fact that, from your description of the situation, the local actors sort of are not there. So, where is the agency of the Ukrainians? Where is their, will? Where is their, you talk about all the West versus East games, but the Ukrainians themselves sort of got lost in the game. And maybe the last point, more related to Asia, given the fact we are here, how this all relates to sort of lessons learned from Ukraine for Taiwan or, for China. You touch upon, all these hotspots or flashpoints. But, in a similar way, what agency does Taiwan have in the whole situation? So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Tereza, thank you. 감사합니다. Tereza, 노보트나 박사님.
Thank you very much, Tereza, and also you and Mr. Kim, Professor Kim, have been a very good discussants. You have given us a lot of food for thought. Now we have to start our discussion, but I'm very sorry to say that it's almost time to wrap up. We already overspent our time. This team, however, will meet again in Berlin offline. Why don't we continue our discussion there and then when we all have these members together? So that will be a great opportunity to continue our discussion. But instead, we have some time for these presenters to answer back in November. Is that okay? So if you agree, we will just close the session today because we already overspent our time. Nevertheless, we have our people present in the hall. Of course, we have some people in the online connection as well. But I'd like to ask people in the room to ask their questions if they have the burning questions. Anybody? If you have questions, please raise your hand. I can see you from here. Is there anybody who has a question? Maybe the staff can let me know if they have any questions in the hall. Maybe we do not have any questions. Well, 1 hour and a half is such a short time. I've never noticed that this amount of time is so limited for this kind of important and wonderful presentations and discussions. We've been able to see the whole picture in a very broad manner so far, thanks to all the presentations and discussions. And so we have benefited a lot by the scholars to have a very broad and wide-minded, and also we had the very detailed discussions as well. The questions and comments were very sharp and also quite edgy by these two discussants. So thank you very much for giving us a great ground for starting our discussions later in November. So see you guys again in November offline. We will just mingle together to have all these discussions. I give you my promise. Now I'll see you then and there in Berlin. And thank you very much. And that's it for this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.